Hello, welcome back. This is Eternal Life Sentence, and I'm coming to you on a rainy night that would honestly be perfect to talk about Vampire the Masquerade, but that is not what we're going to do tonight. Instead, we're going to talk about Doctor Who role-playing game, not Doctor Who the role-playing game, as I've been accidentally calling it for a while. So, I've never really thought of myself as a huge Doctor Who fan. I definitely have seen a few episodes, more than a few episodes, but I was never super into it. It's just kind of a thing I watched sometimes. That being said, I was really interested to see how Cubicle 7 handled a Doctor Who role-playing game. So let's get started. With any role-playing game, I like to start with the visuals because it's a really easy beginning. I like the cover. It definitely shows you what you're in for. The interior is pretty much entirely filled with photos and stills from the show, which it's appropriate. It's pretty high production value looking. But it's not really that exciting from a reviewer's perspective, so there's not a lot to say about that. And Chapter 1 is an introduction. It talks about both what Doctor Who is and what a role-playing game is. And it's here that we're going to see my first major problem and my first minor problem with this game. The minor problem is that none of the chapter titles actually have anything. None of the chapter titles actually represent what's in the book chapter. For example, Chapter 1, the introduction, is called The Trip of a Lifetime. And Chapter 2, the character creation chapter, is Old-Fashioned Heroes from Old-Fashioned Storybooks. And you kind of have to read the chapter to figure out what's in it, or go back and look at the table of contents to read all the subheadings, but you can't just figure out what's in a chapter by reading the chapter title, which I really am not a fan of. The more major problem is that the game doesn't really know who its audience is. Is it Doctor Who fans who might be interested in role-playing games? Because in that case, it explains a lot of things that even very casual Who fans should already know. Things like who the Doctor is and what a companion is. On the other side, if the aim is role players who might be interested in Doctor Who, it doesn't give enough information about the setting to really draw you in, and it explains a lot of role-playing game things that anyone who plays role-playing games would already know. The overall effect is that the game just feels kind of annoyingly simplistic at this stage. Chapter 2 is our character creation chapter, and as I've already mentioned, and this is when we start to address two of the major questions I had going into this, which is, how does a game handle a series that in its original iteration is so focused around the adventures of one character? Not that the companions aren't important, or the people of the week in whatever show they stop, in whatever planet or time the characters stop in, but the Doctor is clearly the star of the show, and that's not a good setup for playing a role-playing game with a group. The other question is, how does the game handle the innate power disparity between a Time Lord and the average human that most of the Doctor's companions are? Sadly, the game kind of waffles on both questions at this stage. They do suggest a few ideas for game modes and story types that don't involve the Doctor at all, but most of them seem like they would miss out on a lot of what the Whoniverse has to offer. And the Doctor power question, I'll have to wait a little bit to explain how they cover it. So let's get into the character generation. Doctor Who, the role-playing game, is a 2d6 based system, and character creation is point buy. So you have a pool of points starting at the beginning, and you can use those to raise both your attributes, those descriptors of who your character is inherently, their ingenuity, their physical strength, etc., and also to purchase traits. Traits are kind of the main focus of this system, and they're broken down into good and bad traits similar to merits or advantages, and then like flaws or weaknesses in many other systems. And they confer just a variety of bonuses and special abilities that you would not be able to get from your straight attributes alone. Some example traits are the good trait Face in the Crowd, which gives you bonuses on rolls where you're trying to like stealthily blend in, and it keeps people from stopping you to question you if you're just wandering around not doing anything suspicious. An example bad trait is Technologically Inept, which just gives you penalties to using technology that you're not familiar with, and then grants you back more points for your point buy pool that you can spend on other good traits or on your attributes. Some of these traits are actually kind of funny. I'm particularly fond of the good trait Screamer, which gives your character the ability to scream really, really loudly to the point that it will stun enemies and give you extra chances to get away. Your characters also get a separate pool of points that they can use to spend on skills, those things that describe what they can do as opposed to their innate qualities. Things like medicine or fighting or something like that. You can, if you have some leftover points from your first pool, you can use those on your skills as well. Finally, each character also has a pool of 12 story points, although this is altered by especially powerful or crippling traits. And they don't really go into what story points are for right now, so I will also skip it as well. And we finish the chapter out with some standard character creation things. Characters need names, characters need appearances, they need backstories, and in the case of Doctor Who role-playing game, they also need a home technology level, which will give them cumulative penalties to deal with technology that seems especially advanced or especially primitive to their eyes. One thing I really do like that they do here is when they're doing their example character creation, to kind of walk you through how the process might look, they don't just stick it all at the beginning of the chapter, where if you're reading this for the first time, you're going to have no idea what any of the things they're talking about are. And they also don't leave it for the end of the chapter when you've already been confused for an entire chapter and have to keep referencing back. They actually break it out into little step-by-step sidebars as you go. Chapter 3 is the rules chapter. The basic mechanic of the game is 2d6 rollover. It will be somewhat familiar to people who are familiar with d20 systems. Essentially, you roll 2d6 and add your rating in the relevant attribute and the relevant skill, plus any bonuses or penalties you get from your traits. One really awesome thing about this is that it actually winds up giving luck and character build equal weight, since the max you can roll on 2d6 is 12, and barring extraordinary circumstances, pretty much all characters will have a max of 6 in each attribute and in each skill. So the max amount of bonus you can get from your character build is also 12. There's also a chart that gives example difficulties for different kinds of tasks. Complicating matters a little bit is the degrees of success system, which will be familiar to anyone who's ever played one of the Fantasy Flight Games Warhammer 40k RPGs. So basically, the more you roll over, the better your success is. The further you roll under, the worse your failure is. They break this out into 6 levels, which they refer to as yes and, yes, yes but, no, and no and. So, for example, were you to get an extremely high amount of success on a roll to decrypt a coded message, you would get a yes and result. Yes, you depict the coded message, and you get an additional positive result that you were not attempting to roll for, such as, and you can read between the lines of the message and figure out who it was originally intended for. If you got a no but result, this would mean this might equal a result like, no, you do not decrypt the message, but you do recognize what kind of code it is and know of someone on another planet who might be able to decrypt it for you for the right price. I do like systems like this. I feel that it adds a little bit of realism and complexity and helps keep everything from turning into a binary yes or no. It also helps GMs come up with story directions, and particularly in the case of failures, and it makes intuitive sense to most players that I've met. They do suggest, if you want to speed up play, that you can roll 2 dice for your actual roll and then a 3rd die to determine the degree of success, with each result, with a different result on the die being a different degree of success. I don't really like this. I don't think that it would speed up the play that much, and it takes away the feeling that how well you roll is really connected to how well you do. It turns it into a binary pass-fail with a completely separate, completely random roll for your degree of success, and that doesn't really work for me. One thing to note here is that you can use those story points from character creation to move up a rung on the success ladder. So if you got a no and result, you could change that to a simple no, or you could change a no but result to yes but a complicated success. And that's one of the main uses for story points within this game. We also get the standard rule permutation things, resisted actions and group actions and things like that. Resolution order is one of the really unique mechanics from this game. I love the way they handle initiative here. Every action round, not necessarily combat, but every round within an action scene begins with all of the players and NPCs declaring their intended actions, and then anyone who has declared that they wish to talk in some way, speak, shout, scream, anything like that, they all go first. Next is anyone who wants to run, aka take any kind of action that involves moving. Next comes the doers, those who wish to do something that is not movement, talking, or combat. And finally, the fighters, anyone who wishes to take a combat action like firing a gun or trying to stab someone or something like that. This works, I don't know how well it would work for any other system, but for a somewhat pulpy universe like Doctor Who, it is an amazing idea. It allows characters to make those dramatic speeches, those attempts to talk people down, those chances to run, and they will always get a chance to try that rather than having to count on rolling right in an initiative order. It's very cinematic, and it also highlights the game's lack of interest in combat, but we will get there in a second. There's also a section on how to keep things interesting when the PCs inevitably lose at some point, which I also appreciate because I don't think enough games talk about that. We get the actual combat rules next: damages, environmental hazards, defense, all that fun stuff. We also get this section entitled Guns Are Bad, which talks about why combat is this dangerous, scary thing in real life that you should never really attempt. And it's all kind of true, but it feels a little out of place. And I'll have to elaborate a little bit on why I feel that's the case. It starts leaving behind role-playing game rules and starts talking about real-life combat, which feels a little almost fourth wall breaking if a not really in character RPG manual can be considered to be fourth wall breaking. It also it feels like a thing players do not need to be told. If you are playing Doctor Who role-playing game, you're probably not looking for a dungeon crawl or a shoot 'em up type game, and the combat rules themselves are pretty clearly fairly lethal. It's not the kind of thing where you'd be expected to take on hordes of enemies. That's not the kind of thing they do in the show. So it feels like they just wanted to tell us this rather than it having any relevance to the game itself, or very little relevance. It's far from the most didactic RPG I've ever seen, though, so I can mostly let it slide. While they're talking about how terrible of a thing combat is, they do offer some alternatives, which is nice. These range from very good, like try to talk people down, run, see if you can find another way to incapacitate people, to kind of bizarre. I'm not sure how many situations that would come up in a game would have calling the police or surrendering as viable options. And more to the point, I don't know that I've ever met a group of characters who's going to be eager to hand the action off to a group of NPCs or just give up when faced with an action situation. But again, it is not particularly breaking with the tone of the game, so I can mostly let it slide. The chapter rounds out with a discussion of a couple of random more things: chase rules, possession rules, and the use of story points. So story points have already been touched on a couple of times, but this is where we get the big breakdown of them. They are useful for a lot of things, and I'm actually just going to have to read off my notes here because I can't remember all the things they do without checking. So, story points can be used to get hints when you're stuck, get an automatic success on a roll, mitigate a failure, as we talked about earlier, do something extraordinary not otherwise covered by the rules, bend the course of the story, build gadgets, and do things that you don't have, and make skill rolls that you don't have any skill points in. So, story points are what I've heard termed meta currency. They are something usually that you can gain and lose throughout the course of a session that doesn't actually represent anything specific within the game world, but is still a stat on your sheet. It only exists in the meta. I'm not a huge fan of meta currency in general, and I'm especially not a fan of story points as presented here. A lot of the things that they do are really good and useful things to have, but they do too many things and interact with too many different systems, and I really am not a fan of the more broader ended ones where you can just bend the story pretty much willy-nilly. Of course, a game master still has to approve what you do, but it feels like, I feel that it's very difficult to game master when at any moment your players can just say, I spend a story point and this is going to happen. Like, I spend a story point and I found the key to this room that it being locked was planned to be a major puzzle. I feel that it makes it very difficult to plan, and then you now have to come up with a good reason as a game master why that can't work, or just scrap parts of your game. I am all for player agency, but I feel that this gives too much control over the course of the narrative to the players in a way that makes it very difficult to game master effectively. Mini rant over. They also cover how to get more story points, heroic actions, deliberately choosing to fail at a role, playing out a bad trait in a spot where it's meaningful, surrendering and getting captured, and also how to lose them without spending them, which is if you kill someone in cold blood, you lose all of your story points, which I feel is appropriate and fits with the tone they're going for. Again, I do think this is a little ripe for exploitation. The game master is going to have to watch and make sure that players are not essentially behaving like idiots just to get a bunch of story points to use later, but that should not be too hard to mitigate. Another annoying thing about this system is that there is no clear advancement mechanic. Characters get better when the game master says they can, how the game master says they can. I find that is extremely frustrating for players when they can't work towards something specific that they want to do with their character. Obviously, they are free to ask the game master for something, but there's no experience points, there's no milestones. You just get stuff when the game master says you do. Items are the final bit of this rather long chapter. Items in Doctor Who role-playing game are divided into two categories. Equipment is just basic stuff that does functions. Water bottles, flashlights, stuff like that. And they only really matter when they are from a vastly different technology level than the character is familiar with, back to that home technology level from character creation. Gadgets, on the other hand, are one of the really cool features of this system, and those are just all those cool things that you come to expect from a Doctor Who setting and game. And gadgets are actually built in a very similar way to characters, in that each one has story points that you can use to make it do things it wouldn't normally do, and they also have traits. And you create what the gadget does by stacking on traits. So if I wanted to make a remote lock opener, I would give it a trait that allows it to send out some sort of signal or beam, and I would give it another trait that allows it to open things. And if I start running out of trait points to build my gadget with, I can add bad traits onto it. Things like maybe it requires special fuel or is too big to move around easily, to increase the power of the device. And it includes some sample ideas in the chapter to get your ideas flowing. Chapter 4 deals with something that I don't see a lot of RPGs address, and is probably what you've been thinking of this entire time, which is time travel. They talk about various things, including how creating paradoxes, the universe kind of naturally wants to smooth it over, but if you fail to do that, or you create too big of a paradox, you'll just sort of swing off into a time spur, a little mini parallel universe, until you can resolve the paradox, and or the creatures known as Reapers just destroy everything inside it. They talk about how the dangers of traveling too far forward or too far backward in time, and various other things. The problem here is that it's pretty much all narrative. They do talk about how all of this is there to make adventuring easier, not harder, and essentially game masters can just kind of hand wave whatever would make the story harder and hone in on things that make the story more interesting. And they do give a few actual mechanical things for stuff like piloting the TARDIS, but pretty much all of this is just world building info. There's no rules for how successive attempts to interfere in the same event are harder. There's no rules governing how to get to or from a parallel universe. You just kind of gotta make it all up. And in a game that's focused around time travel, that's extremely disappointing because that is such a huge focus of the show that you would think at least some mechanics would touch on it. They don't even talk about ways to tell if a paradox is likely to occur. Chapter 4 also introduces the Time Lords, also known as the Gallifreyans, who are basically humans but better. They have 2 hearts, they're immune to a lot of diseases, they can survive in many environments better than humans can, and they are what the Doctor is. And one of the notable traits that they have is regeneration. Essentially, when they die, they can come back a limited number of times via regenerating into a new form. This new form can change appearance quite drastically, up to and including becoming a different gender. They also experience some personality changes, but mostly to surface level characteristics. The core of who they are does stay the same. They give us some rules for the regenerations, a random table that you can roll on, and they suggest that if one player is playing the Doctor, when a regeneration happens, they actually pass the character to a new player who then plays the Doctor, which is a clever way to get that same character but also different vibe. Finally, Chapter 4 also talks about the TARDIS, the time and relative dimension in space, goes over some of the characteristics of this rather extraordinary device, which is the main time travel ship for the show, and also has a lot of other fun things like being larger on the inside, containing dozens of rooms in the space of a old-fashioned British police call box, and having danger alarms, and even being semi-sentient. More rules related to Time Lords and TARDISes are promised in an upcoming supplement. Chapter 5 is a mini bestiary. This might surprise players who are coming straight from D&D who are used to a 3-part core book, but Doctor Who role-playing game actually includes everything you need to get started in the one main book. And all of the classic monsters from the revived Doctor Who series are going to be here. You've got Weeping Angels, you've got Cybermen, you've got Daleks, and the rest of the entries are all from 12's run, as far as I can tell. And we do see more that they seem to assume that everyone who is going to play this game has watched a fair amount of Doctor Who, which is not an assumption I think they should be making, but they don't necessarily provide as much fleshing out of the different creatures as I think that they could or should. For example, I have seen Girl in the Fireplace, so I know what the Clockwork Robots are all about, but I have not seen the episode of 12's run with the spider germs, and from what they gave me, I couldn't entirely figure out how I would use one in an adventure. Most of the monsters and aliens that are not classic things are from 12's run, because this is the 12th Doctor edition that I happen to have. Chapter 6 is the How to Roleplay chapter. It doesn't really go in a specific order, it kind of just jumps around with different bits of advice. Most of it is pretty standard, things like don't hog the spotlight, and the rules are there to help your fun, not hinder it, and so if something is causing trouble, just throw it out. One piece that I do really like that they included was, like, don't be worried if your first couple of games are awkward. It happens, which I think every new role player needs to be told. The chapter also discusses some of the recurring themes of Doctor Who, things like the power of the human spirit, a sense of mystery and exploration. And I also like sections like this. It's good for getting plot ideas and character ideas started without just straight telling you this is what you should do. They hammer home the pacifism angle here some more, and they specifically equate refusing to use a gun with taking the moral high ground. And I don't want to see a discussion about gun control down in the comments, but I think regardless of what you feel about this issue in real life, it's not something a tabletop role-playing game should be trying to address, particularly not a somewhat quirky, soft sci-fi where getting thrown out the airlock or infected with alien goo is just as common or more as being shot. And it feels very out of place, and like the authors paused to just mention this to us when it really is kind of a non sequitur. This really isn't overwhelming, but it will annoy some players as a heads up. They also talk about game mastering again a little bit. The advice is all pretty good, although some of it is a little vaguer than I would like. On the brighter side, they do talk about things like handling absent players and some of the common problem player types that come up in games, so that is useful. And they reiterate that there is no built-in advancement mechanic and you only get better when and how the game master says you can. Chapter 7 covers how to write and run stories. There's not a lot to talk about here. Stories need a setup, a beginning, a middle, and end. There needs to be conflict, there needs to be an antagonist, etc., etc., etc. One thing that works both really, really well for the genre and actually pretty well for RPGs in general is to think of each session or small group of sessions like a TV show, and how even if there's a longer running plot, you need to have a little mini arc to each session, which is a great way to think of it. It does appear that somewhat episodic is the general way to run this game. You're going to want to wrap up most of what you do within just one or a couple of sessions and then move on to a new thing. They talk about the need for personal story arcs and actually offer some advice on how to string some of these episodes into longer running story arcs. So it all works out pretty well. Chapter 8 is actually a pair of sample adventures. Stormrise is the first of these. It is a lot simpler in setup. The characters are all in a small English fishing village. Several years ago, the village experienced a very large storm, and at the dedication to a memorial for those lost in the storm, another equally large storm appears to be coming up, but that storm might not be entirely mundane. I like this adventure. It's pretty simple, like I said, but there's a few NPCs. None of them super stand out as fascinating, but there's a few plots to get involved in. They talk about ways to make this a first adventure for a group, which is what I would use it for if I was going to be GMing it. They also talk about how to fit it into an ongoing game, and again, even a few options for how to keep things going if the bad guy wins. So I think this is a really solid adventure, especially to include in a core book. The other adventure is called Seeing Eyes, and that one's a little more complicated. There's a lot going on. There's multiple villains and several other neutral to positive factions. The characters are blind for part of the adventure. There's a lot going on. It's fairly complicated, and it's a lot more lethal than Stormrise. And there's some interesting ideas in it that I would love to play with in a game, but I would not use it as a first adventure, and I'm not even entirely sure I would run it as is. That's all I'm really going to say about those adventures because I am trying not to give spoilers for them. But I will say that Stormrise is definitely a better option for a beginning player or game master group. Finally, we get an appendix with a bunch of pre-generated characters. We get the Doctor, we get Clara, we get Madame Vostra. We get a lot of side characters, or what I'm assuming are side characters from some of 12's adventures, and also a few generic templates like a unit soldier and a rock star and a school kid and things like that. And this is where we discuss my final problem with this system, which I initially brought up all the way back at the very beginning, and that is the balance issue. The way that Doctor Who role-playing game balances the innate power disparity between powerful aliens like Time Lords and ordinary Earth humans is by changing the amount of story points they get. The more powerful you are, the fewer story points you have. And this is a good attempt, but I just really have my doubts as to how well it's going to actually work at the table. I don't think that having 4 fewer story points is damaging in the game to the point that it makes up for all of the advantages that playing as the Doctor versus a generic person gives you. There is one character that actually has more than the base 12 story points. They are a child, and thus the lower stats are made up for by additional story points. But again, I just don't think this really works as a balancing mechanism. So overall, the Doctor Who role-playing game is a fairly simple system with a lot of care taken to making it feel as much like the show as possible. The core book includes pretty much everything a new player or GM would need to get started apart from dice, and there's even some sample adventures in the back. I love the unique take on initiative, and I love the balance between luck and character build. I think it makes for a really satisfying setup. However, the balance issues and the lack of actual character advancement mechanics or time travel mechanics are what keep this from being something I would clearly recommend, along with some mild preachiness and just a little bit more attention needed on the world building. Overall, I'd say if you like Doctor Who and a Doctor Who role-playing game sounds interesting to you, I would pick this up. But if you're not already a fan of the series, this is not going to change your mind, and if you're not familiar with it at all, you really should at least watch a couple episodes before you decide this is something you want to pick up. Anyway, this has been Eternal Life Sentence. Thank you for joining me for my first game review, and let me know what you think in the comments if you think I should do more of these, which I probably will anyway. Don't forget to like and subscribe and follow me on Twitter at EternalRPGs for all sorts of updates and sneak previews. And I will see you next week. Bye!